The Center for Educational Media and the College of Education at Middle Tennessee State University are proud to offer professional development to K-12 educators in Tennessee through our online video library. These videos are aligned with standards set by the Tennessee Department of Education. For more professional development videos, check out our website at cem.mtsu.edu.
This is Dr. Clark Briggs. She is with Metro Nashville. You want to tell them what you teach? She's a little bit different than I am.
I work with 12th grade at-risk students. I teach Spanish, English, sometimes French, depending on the needs, ESL, a little bit of everything. So I kind of see what happens at that 11th hour, and we'll be doing a presentation tomorrow on that for the secondary teachers and educators in here.
I started out in high school, so I taught Spanish and English in high school and at Sequatchie County. Do we have anybody from Sequatchie County? At Sequatchie County, I was also the only ESL certified person and the only translator for the district, so they loaned me out to everybody. So a lot of you guys are probably in the same position where you fill a lot of different roles, and it's really hard to feel like you're doing a good job with all of those because you're spread thin. You're doing a good job. My experience is I see all kinds of teachers. You probably do too as an instructional coach.
My first year.
You will. You will. And what I have experienced is every time I walk in a classroom, at first the teacher's like, I think I know what I'm doing. When in reality, my experience is that you're just isolated in that one room and you really are a rock star. You're killing it. You just don't know what's happening down the hall. You know, you don't have anybody to compare to or to see what's going on around you or to know how really good you are. So feel confident that if you're trying and you're here and you're looking, you're probably a rock star. From high school, because I realized that teaching Spanish was great and teaching reading or English was great, but I wasn't working with the struggling readers very much. They were in my class, and they were just sort of abandoned in there, and they could not read. And I thought, what in the world do I do? How do I help these folks? And it's such a mishmash. By the time they get to high school, you've got some of everybody, and they're thrown in there to get a credit. And I loved my kids, and a lot of times they would come and they would say, can you help me? I don't want anybody to know this, but I can't read. Or I can't read well. Or about a third of them will write on a piece of paper and say, don't ask me to read aloud in class. And I couldn't help them. I didn't know what to do. So I thought, I need more education because I want to make a difference. I've got to get more education. So I came over to MTSU, enrolled in the Literacy Studies program, went over to elementary ESL, and did some co-teaching in first grade. And I was teamed up with a rock star first grade teacher who knew what she was doing. She knew how to teach reading, and she was, a lot of y'all are pretty young. She was looking up stuff on the internet, looking for new ideas, and she'd walk in and she'd say, today we're going to try this, and I would say, not going to work. And it would work. And it would work beautifully. And so what I learned was, I got to free up what I'm thinking is going to work and really look for some new ideas and pay attention to what's going on around me, because I learned a lot from her. I still didn't know enough, so I'm learning about reading. And then I taught SPED for 3.5 years, and I thought, wow, ESL is hard, and first grade reading is hard. SPED is everything. It's all the way across how many people are in SPED? SPED? Yeah, you get everything. And how many people get the phone call? Hey, can you come down here? We've got a new kid. Something ain't right. If we give them to you, will you fix them? Sure, I'm gonna get out my super glue and my duct tape. You know, because what do? We're gonna talk a little bit about what reading looks like and the processes involved in reading for a typical neurotypical reader before their ELL, before their SPED, okay, before those other additional exceptional, topic, a little bit of extra layer on the onion comes into play. If you'll go ahead and flip to the next one.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take an overview of.
Right now we're going to talk about reading development and language acquisition in typical first language, L1, and second language, L2 readers who might have a learning disability. And I bet everybody here is thinking of a student. does this person have a reading disability? We're going to look at how we can try to tease that out and how to provide support for those guys, even if we can't tease out exactly, is it a second language problem or is it reading disability? So Laura looked up some of this data for us, and several people believe that there are about 8% of ELLs in the U.S. probably have a learning disability. That could be true because think about it. About 8% of your non-ELL, your language 1 students have a learning disability, so that would make sense. However, to determine where the problem is it second language acquisition or is it a reading disability or language disability, you've got to look at several things in there. And one of those is the characteristics of how we learn a second language.
Also, being able to understand, and of course when we have students from all over the world and lots of different languages represented in our classrooms, one of the things that we are challenged by is how many different languages are spoken and how their development is at that particular point. And I'm curious, do any of you all have any children that are from Burma? Some of you? Okay, so you know the Ska Karen? Okay, so one of our colleagues had some students that he was asking them to do classification because of their science EOCs that they were looking at, and they would group things together in a way that didn't make any sense to him. If you've dealt with students that speak Ska Korean, there are different classification characteristics where if an object is round or if it's flat or whatever, they may classify it differently. And so he's trying to figure out, is this student not understanding my question, because these things shouldn't be grouped together. One of the studies that had been pulled out from the 1970s was if you had cardboard. If you said, let's group these things together, somebody from Burma may take a piece of cardboard and a cardboard box and say those things are together because of the material they're made of, where if you had an English speaker, they may classify a plastic box and a cardboard box together because they're boxes. And so just that bit of insight into the languages of the students that you teach can also provide some additional information, but it is challenging. It is.
Typically developing elementary students go right into reading. So reading is the foundation for learning everything else, especially as they go on through school. If they haven't gotten it early on, then they're missing a whole lot of instruction and content knowledge as they move forward through school. The other problem is reading's a complex process, and it involves a lot of different things. It's not just one little thing, and I'm going to show you just a diagram that kind of will give you an idea of the complexity of the problem. Learning to read, so learning in your first language is complex. Learning to read in your second language is exponentially complex. How many people in here speak another language? So you have an idea of what that looks like when you're trying to read in another language. How many, this is just off topic just a little bit, how many people did not grow up speaking a second language, but learned it, I would say synthetically or through school or another way, playmates or, okay. Two things going on that you've probably witnessed and didn't really think about. Reading is receptive, and that is you see it, you don't have to generate the thought from your own head. When you're writing and you're composing thoughts, that's a lot harder, and it's going to develop a lot more slowly. You may have, it's an expressive thing. So you may have students that can talk pretty well, but then they can't put the thoughts on paper, or the process becomes so heavy for them. So many cognitive things going on at one time that even if they can express themselves verbally, they have a really hard time getting that out on paper. Here's one thing that I didn't know that I thought was very fascinating, and I passed on to my high school students, and they were like blown away. When a child is born, they have these little supercomputer brains going on. Now, we older people have figured this out. We're not as fast as we used to be. When you're a child, the first thing you're doing is you're just sitting, and your brain is just taking in all this information. It's clicking along so much faster than it is for us now. We're hearing streams of sound come past us. And it takes months as we hear that sound to determine that there are breaks in the sound and to figure out that those are words and that they have a similar pattern. And if you're hearing multiple languages, amazingly, kids develop all that at the same time. They're that smart. They're not like us. As you go older, though, as you get a little bit older, our brains slow down. And you've all heard, if you don't use it, you lose it. Okay, well, this is really actually true. fMRI studies show that there is synaptic pruning going on. So if you're not exposed to a great deal of language as you're younger, or you're having difficulty reading when you're younger, and you wait and you say, okay, I'm going to wait until 4th grade to start remediating this child, or it gets put off later and later, it becomes exponentially more difficult because you're missing all of those parts that have been just pruned away. What we do have when we get older is our fluid intelligence that we had when our little supercomputer brains were zipping along learning all this stuff. As older people, we have crystal intelligence, and that's all of the information that we've taken in and our experiences. So we have that benefit. We don't have to jump off the roof now with an umbrella to know that's not going to end well. What I also thought was very interesting is that there is a huge connection between what you hear and what you're able to read. And that didn't make a lot of sense for me at first. I thought it would be more like what you see and what you know, that there would be a bigger connection there, but it is not. It's all about what you hear. Students that cannot find rhyming words. Have you had any children that could not hear words that rhyme? Mm-hmm. Okay, and they're probably going to have trouble spelling. They're going to have trouble reading the words on the page. They're going to have some of those difficulties because they're not hearing the words to start with. So those symbols, that connection between what you hear and the sound that that symbol makes, that letter, is not going to be very clear. It's kind of a mystery because they just don't hear it. Listening comprehension. Now this is interesting. If I read a story to you and then I start getting information back and you're telling me things like main idea and details of the story, and then you're able to maybe make inferences and then go on to make connections to your background knowledge and things like that, that gives me a really good idea of what your reading comprehension is going to be. If we're talking and I'm reading a story, giving you informational text, and you're not able to make those connections, you're not getting that information orally, you're going to have a really big time. It's a lot to overcome to get that reading comprehension because it's not there orally first. The normal reading progression starts with, you're working on, a lot of you will know this, you're working on your reading automaticity. So you're looking at decoding, you're looking at the sounds that the letters make on the page, you're looking at sight word recognition, and those two things give us word reading. So decoding the words that are decodable and the most common sight words, and a lot of us have worked with the Dolch lists or whatever. We're trying to get the word reading up to speed. The faster we can read, the more times we can read the words, they become automatic and we don't have to think about that reading. And when we don't have to think about that, we're not clogging up our short-term memory with the synthetic part of reading, the process of reading, we can start concentrating on what the words mean. 3rd grade, here is another, something that I thought was very interesting, and I didn't really think about it. I guess after 3rd grade, you're really not teaching students to read the words on the page. If they haven't gotten it by then, everybody else has moved on. We've shifted into reading for information. So if you're still, especially in special ed, if we get somebody in 4th grade that's reading on a 1st grade level, they're missing all of this content knowledge that their peers are getting because they're working on, in 4th grade, 3rd grade too, they're working on those comprehension skills. So if they've not got it by 4th grade, or you've got an ELL student that's moved in and doesn't read in their first language, they weren't in school with the other kids coming through, they're going to be behind automatically, one, trying to learn the language, but two, that content is gone. You've missed it, and we're moved on to something else. It's really hard to catch up. You will find math. How many folks have ELL students that just love math? Right? They're only dealing with 10 digits, right? 0 to 9, that's only 10 symbols. And they're pretty universal. A lot of them are the same in other languages. Not all, but a lot. And it's something constant. It's a little bit easier for them and a little more linear than language, which comes from everywhere. Reading volume. So the other thing that's happening is, with a typically developing child, as they're going through and they're reading more and more, and at the end of 1st grade, they should be reading 65 words a minute or better. Now they're speeding up, more and more automaticity, and they're reading every night. And hopefully they're enjoying reading. And as they're getting that volume, they're reading faster, and they're learning a lot of vocabulary. That's where the vocabulary growth comes from, and that's where a lot of your content knowledge comes from, is the amount of reading that you're doing. You build background knowledge that way. For those folks that aren't, you have sort of a graph that looks like this, and then they start going up as they're learning to read. But for those folks that are reading typically, it's like this. That's how much more their vocabulary is growing. And that's in a first language speaker, okay? When you're looking at L2, it's all about vocabulary, right? And if you're not reading, that's the number one way you're gaining your vocabulary. If you're not reading, you're really left behind trying to catch up with your peers. So this is what it looks like. There are a couple of different models. This is just one that shows you sort of the rotation. You're working on word recognition. It's hard to read the word if you don't know. You're reading cat, you can sound it out, but what does cat mean? Like, does it pop up a picture of a cat in your brain? Makes it harder if you don't know the vocabulary words you're trying to read. Accuracy, so we're working on accuracy, which comes down to rate, right? We're trying to speed all these things up, we're trying to get our fluency faster, and when we start doing that, we're having some reading success, and that fuels our reading volume, because who wants to do something you're not successful at? That goes to building vocabulary. Again, that's another reason, because that cycle, that's where that huge vocabulary gap comes in for our students. It slows down their reading comprehension. Now this will show you what's going on, especially with ELLs. Right here, word recognition, folks, we're looking at phonemic awareness. Can you hear the sounds of the words? Cat. Do you hear 3 sounds? Cat. Okay. Decoding and spelling. So decoding is a receptive, right? The word's already there. Spelling, expressive, it's going to be more difficult. And then the sight word recognition. So you're working on these 3 skills, especially when you're in K1, 2. That's what you're working on. And you may have a lot of success with your ELLs. A lot of our second language learners will get really good at that. And they'll fool you. Because here's what's really going on up here with language comprehension. And these are just some of the processes going on. These are the big ones. Background knowledge. Okay, if they've come from another country, their background knowledge is going to be very different unless they really grew up in the U.S. Okay? And even then, their culture is going to be different. Their families are different. Vocabulary knowledge. How much and what vocabulary do their parents use? That's your first experience, is what's going on in the family and around you. Language structures. Wow. The grammar, the expectations, the phrases that go together, all of the things that make, when we're reading, that make it all come together for us. We can predict a lot of what's going to happen in a sentence because we already know what the language structure looks like. Verbal reasoning. Laura, you might know more about verbal reasoning. I'm thinking with the older kids and literacy knowledge. All of these things, this is not just elementary folks. This is for everybody, adult learners, everybody.
I think one of the biggest things that we think about, and especially, you know, if your principal at your school doesn't have this background in reading, doesn't understand what all goes into it, you know, if we talk about, you know, what are they learning with phonics, and how are they doing with their decoding, how are they doing with their sight words, and how are they doing with comprehension, and comprehension's kind of looked at like a unitary construct, but it's really not. It is so much more. And I think that's probably one of the most important takeaways if you're talking to somebody who does not do what you do in your job. Comprehension is not just something that we check off, because there are so many layers to it. That was really the only thing that I wanted to mention to that, because getting these things to happen are fairly easy, but it's that other piece. And honestly, building the exposure, building the background knowledge for the students, that's where a lot of that comes in. And that's really a home-school partnership in order to make that effective.
And bringing in a lot of materials. How many people bring boxes, like shoe boxes? You got the shoebox collection to go with different stories of, you've been out there collecting the moss and the bark because they don't know what that is. Yeah. All right, so here's some of the components that you should look for in a really stout reading program for your students. Phonics and sight words. If you're looking for elementary and you're beginning, you've got to have phonics and sight words, folks. That's the first thing. They've got to be able to read the words on the page. With that, you're going to be looking at some reading comprehension strategies. And a lot of us are really good with some of our schemas and our diagrams that we do. That can look like a lot of different things. It can be as simple as changing your vocabulary around a little bit so that you're asking, what do these words make you picture? I've changed that with my husband. It's amazing. When I say, what do you want for dinner? I get, whatever. What do you picture us having for dinner is a totally different answer. I'm telling you, write that down. Try that. With your husbands. It probably work with your students too, but try with your husbands. Okay. Listening comprehension. It's for a second language learner sitting in a classroom all day long drowning in language. It is exhausting. It's exhausting. It's a lot if you're reading a story to them, or you're reading a passage, or you're reading a sentence. You know, break it down to whatever they need, and then get information back. Especially if you've got these guys at the end of the day. How many people get them at the end of the day when they're just like, they're done? Yeah, bless them, okay? And you would be too. I think a lot of times, if you've not been to a foreign country and you've sat there and you've been bombarded with that language, you don't know just how exhausting that is. Guided reading. Okay. Guided reading is great. It's not round robin reading, folks. Let them volunteer. Support them, scaffold them. You'll be amazed because they'll be killing each other trying to get that hand up that they want to read next. It's a good time to practice fluency, retell, accuracy. They feel confident. The more times, this was something that I was surprised at, they don't get bored reading the same story because they want to be good at it and they want to feel like they're really doing something and they're able to read with some sort of prosody, like that it sounds good with inflection, and they want to be skillful readers. So repeated reading is great. It's a good time to work on all those things. Speed. I have to work. Mine will try to speed things up, so I have to watch them. Because right away they want to get that, hey, Tommy. You'll see that really quickly, right? Tommy. So you may have to back off of that and say, hey, it's not all about that. I want to see how well you can read it. And you may have to read a sentence. I'm amazed, especially with students that have autism. And you get a very flat affect, and they're reading like a computer. And it's all one speed, turtle speed for a couple of mine. I'm like, hey, we're off turtle speed. Let's go. Can't do it. Nope, that's my speed, he'll say. Okay? Until I read it. I'm like, hey, it's my turn. It's my sentence. I read, you read. And then it's amazing that they can copy your speech patterns. That's okay. Give them that pattern, and they can't hear it enough times. That's not cheating. It's okay to do that. All right. Now we're looking for the disabilities because we know 8% of these guys out there probably have a disability, and it's going to be really hard to find them. Can they match up the sound that the letters make? Do they see CH as one unit and go ch? Or is it off? That's a skill that they're going to be able to find pretty quickly. It should be one that they latch onto right away. So the letters, sounds, digraphs, EA says E, those kind of basic concepts, usually our guys love that because that's like working with numbers. That's a given. Okay, we know that's going to make this sound, except for the exceptional words. Decoding, they're having trouble with decoding. So if they've gotten the sounds and symbols connected, and they know that OA is going to say O, and SH is going to say sh, but they can't put the sounds together. Like they can't get ship sounded out. And they constantly have trouble getting them there, or they get them in the wrong order. They can say sh, it, and then they say pish, or whatever. And you've seen this. Yes, and then they look at that, and they're like, something's not right. I know I just said that differently, but they can't quite figure it out. So if that continues to be a problem, and you've simplified, and you've gone down to 2 sounds, and they're still having a hard time with 2 sound words, we might want to look at that. That should not be a processing difficulty for a typically developing child. Sight word recognition. This is another skill that typically children excel at. They love sight words. And I can show you a couple of quick things if we have time at the end on sight word books and some games to play. I mean, they will beg. I'm not lying to you. I had a child break down in tears. And he would not work with my EA. And I said, come over here. Come on. I'm working with my group. She's working with your group. And nobody's working over here. What's going on? And he says to me, well, my family is going to be out of town, and I'm not going to get to read my sight words. And I said, oh, we can totally do that. Go back, finish this. You can stay here. He's like, can I come during recess? I want to read my sight words. We got you. We'll play a game. It'll be all good. We love to read the sight words. If they're struggling with that, they're avoiding that, probably going to be a problem. Reading in context. The little simple stories that we're talking about that our ELs are reading that are maybe 3 sentences or even 1 sentence, and they're able to read pretty fluently. They can get the sentence or 2 or even 3 sentences out, and it sounds pretty fluent, but they can't tell you that they just read about a fish in a dish. We might have a problem, especially if you read it to them and they still can't talk about the fish in the dish. Word reading accuracy. Ongoing struggle. We're looking for them to read the words that are actually there, not guess the words. That's why that's why we use pseudo words. Is anybody curious, like, why in the world are we using these pseudo words? Because honestly, I had that conversation at first. I thought, this is years back, but I looked at that and I'm like, non-words, like ip. Who cares if they can read ip? I want them to be able to read the words on the page. We do that, and I tell the students, I'm very upfront with why we're doing what we're doing. Hey, I'm not wasting your time, and we're going to read some words that are just crazy. They're made up. They don't exist, and that's because I want to see if you actually know the skill and not if you can guess the word, because I know you're smart enough. You can run through the whole dictionary in your head till you get the right word, and that's why I'm making up some fake words. Reading rate. Can they get the reading rate up? Can they get the fluency up? And can they read with expression? Here's another big pitfall. I've got some that can, I've got one that I will show you an example of. I've been working with her for 3 years. We've got her reading the words on the page. She's zipping along. She's getting better with expression, but you can still tell her comprehensions are problems. So she's reading the words on the page, and she's not knowing what the words mean. That's where it starts fading into reading with expression, starts moving us right into reading comprehension. And this is a whole, it's like the rainbow, folks. It just kind of blends from one color to another. Here's what we look at. This is just some kids the first little bit of last year. And some of you may know this. The blue is a cold read. It's just a weekly little thing we do for 60 seconds. And I don't know, maybe Friday, I give them, when they're reading their paragraph for the week or whatever, I give them the new paragraph, and this is their cold read. This little booger could read like 2 words a minute in the Matt whatever story. And then he was able to read 22 words a minute the next week after we've been working on it all week. When you see a child, and this is their hot read, we've worked on it all week, and bless them, they can read 3 words a minute at the end of the week. We're probably going to have a problem unless they have just come into the country. If they've been with us kindergarten, and now we're in the first week, first month, first grade, and that's all we're getting, probably going to have a problem because they should at least be able to read the words on the page. Everybody got that? Y'all are looking puzzled. Yes, no? More questions? Moving on.
If they're a newcomer, like you said, if they're new, how long do I need to give them for language acquisition before I'm looking at difficulty with the second language? Does that make sense?
It does, and that's an excellent question because we all know they roll in just whenever they show up, all the time. And if you've got one, so for example, in my kindergarten group, I had a big kindergarten group and I had a little girl from China that moved in, and most of my other kids were Spanish speaking. She was very smart. Okay, you knew right from talking with her that she knew what was going on. She had just a little bit of English. She was very outgoing, so it did not bother her being in with a bunch of strangers. She jumped in there, and within a month, she's teaching everybody in the class Chinese, and they're learning. So here's the deal. It depends on their personality, and also when they roll in, the younger they are, those guys are learning so much faster. As a complete comparison, I'm 49, and I will be 49 in 10 years when you ask me. I'm 49, and I have a 5th grader that last year at dismissal was putting his kindergarten sister in the car every day, one of the highlights of my day, they're so cute. And he would come out, and Henry would say, do you know the words? I worked all last year to learn 10 words of Chinese, and I remember 3 of them, okay? And I'm pretty good with language, but I'm getting old, okay? When you're young like that, Ella would come out there, and she's so frustrated, like she spoke nothing at the first day of kindergarten. At the end of kindergarten, she's like, what's up with you? I don't understand. She's got the language. She's got the street language, right? And she's got academic language, which they tend to pick up quicker. But her little brain's just racing on. And to her, it doesn't matter. She's hearing 5 different languages at one time. They're able to absorb that much if they're neurotypical. All right, so when do we start worrying? Depends on what grade level and when they came in. If you're in 1st grade and they're just rolling in for the first time, I don't start worrying until the end of 2nd grade. Okay? If we're in 5th grade and they've rolled in, and we don't want somebody with a beard in 3rd grade, right? So we put them in 5th grade. They shouldn't drive to elementary school. But probably, in high school, they're not going to have somebody that's able to break it down to the level that they need. Maybe they didn't have any school. We've seen that. They come in, they don't even know how to work a pen or a binder, don't know how to open a binder, any of those really basic things. You're overcoming a lot more. The answer to that is I would not be expecting to look at them for SLD for a specific learning deficit or something like that for probably, I don't know, a long time. It really depends unless you can see something very, very obvious.
And it's such a good question because that's what we all want to know. When should we worry? What's okay? And unfortunately, the studies out there, the research out there, does not give us anything really solid because it depends on the exposure to their first language, parental support, age of the child when they came in, even the orthography of the language that they came in. So there's so many different factors when you start trying to go through there and say, okay, where should I worry? There's nothing really definitive out there in a lot of second language acquisition studies or in some of the research that's specifically for ELs, and that's something that we all want to know. So what we can do in the alternative is at least kind of have a radar up for, okay, what things are kind of universal across different languages. If I have a reading disability, it will present itself in my first language this way, and it will also present itself in my second language this way. And so we look for those little things, and that kind of gives you that red flag. But aside from that, I wish we had something that was, yeah, it's frustrating. It is.
They're all completely unique. Go ahead.
This is a big problem for in our school because, for example, if we take your example, we have somebody come in as a newcomer in first grade, and they exhibit some of these deficits in phonemic awareness early on, and we go, well, let's wait till the end of second grade to see if it continues, and it does continue, and then we don't even start. Then we bring it to the attention. Then it takes another year or two of collecting data on that student. Now they're 3 or 4 years behind. And we've got kids in kindergarten that we can go almost in the first term or quarter. We suspect something's not processing right here, but we have to wait 3, 4 years?
No, we should not have to wait 3 or 4 years is the answer to that. We can identify that.
I actually kind of want to talk about what happens when we over-identify children in elementary school and then they end up in middle school and then they're in SPED and they don't need to be. That's a problem. That's a huge problem. Well, now with the new process, with the new RTI process, we can absolutely transition them out into the appropriate places. And so, but we are finding with the new RTI process, there are a lot of English learners that were over-identified in elementary school when they just needed more time. Right. And if your instruction in ESL is proper in the way it should be, and they're just a slower learner, you're still going to see that progress. Right. If you've got to be careful between watching what is progress with an English learner and that learning disability, and if they're continuing to make progress and they're not falling behind, then you probably need to just continue them in ESL. Right. As someone who has had many students come to me in middle school that have really quickly transitioned out of, we have a really good SPED team, and so we coordinate with them, and they'll within their 6th grade year, if they're transitioning them out of special education, and then within another year we're transitioning them out of ESL, it tells me they didn't have good instruction in elementary. No offense to any elementary teacher in here.
No, but you're exactly right.
Well, and that's the argument we hear, but I'm talking about students, ma'am, that still don't know that short A is at the end of the first year and then again at the end of the second year. That's a to me.
And they should know that.
Yeah, it doesn't take.
And we're going to talk about some comparisons that we can look at. So some ways that we can look at among other ELL, typical ELL, even siblings, to see, is this the right pattern? If they're in with it, if they're properly grouped and they're getting the right instruction, we should be seeing progress. Right. If we're just seeing no progress, there's a problem. Yeah, there's a problem.
But we don't have a recourse for those kids. It's really frustrating to watch them fall through the cracks and our hands are tied.
But we can talk about that. So we have hope. You had a question.
Statement question. And what they were talking about downstairs, and I'm SPED, have very little knowledge with ELL. They have to do the assessment with a recently arrived student within 30 days, right, of their arrival.
That's right.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first 30 days, they'll be looking at the language, their native language and their accessibility to that. So that first 30 days, that test, does it have, what does it gauge? How well they speak their native language?
No. It's totally in English.
Just measuring English. Can they follow oral directions?
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of get up and touch the door, walk to the door and turn around.
Listening, speaking, reading, and writing.
Yeah, it's all academic.
It's hard.
So we're not talking about like, I'm sorry, I did a lot of kindergarten and first grade screening. We're not talking about that anymore?
That's what it's still, it's very tough.
Very tough.
It's the way that.
We're not doing TELPA? Still TELPA, yeah? No, we've changed from TELPA. Okay, now we're on the WIDA. Okay, sorry. False information.
And I guess my question is, in my situation, because I'm RT, I teach, let me back up. If I have a child with an IEP that has a reading goal, they come to me for direct service during RTI time. Sure. So we work on our IEP goals in lieu of RTI Tier 2, Tier 3. We work on IEP goals. That drives my lesson plan. We still meet the fluency and comprehension necessity for RTI. That's how it's explained to me in my county anyway. Red flags show up when we do our progress monitoring with them. If we're not seeing, and then we change strategies, and if we're not seeing, but after about 6 weeks, if we're not seeing progress, it's at that point that they can bring it to my attention or to my administrator's attention, and then we can put them on our radar to look at, because we do have a set of twins that came to us as ELs that we lost a year and a half with because we were trying to determine if it was language acquisition or if it was a disability. And it did turn it into that we tested them and they both qualified.
So they had the same problem in their first language as they did in the second language?
Yes, so, but we did give them a year. We did not let it go for multiple years so we wouldn't lose it anymore. Unfortunately, we did lose a year and a half, and they are making progress, but they're not where we want them to be yet. But in our county, they would still have been placed in like a Tier 3 RTI class. Exactly. And typically those are taught by the special ed teachers. So they're getting RTI services, but they're being taught by special ed.
That's unique.
So the brain, because the brain of a special ed teacher 9 times out of 10 functions slightly different.
Yep.
And so they still get the benefit
of Tier 3. I'm less concerned, and we can talk about this a little bit further down the road, on the identification. We want to be sure that the kids actually get what they need. So we can call it a lot of different things, but what you want to do is look around in the school, in the setting, and figure out, all right, team, what's the best path forward? Who is the strongest instructor or the strongest program, or what's this child's particular needs? What do we have to do to get them reading and understanding to the best of their ability? What does that look like? So it might not always look like SPED, and we don't want to rush into SPED. I'm with you on this because I also had a big complaint, and that was I inherited a huge group of SPED students, and I said, you know what? If they're 3 grade levels behind, they're learning disabled, reading disabled, and I can exit them in 2 years, they were not SLD. That doesn't mean they're not, and we don't want to keep anybody out that belongs in there.
I'm not advocating for SPED. I'm just advocating for more help, for something else for these children. And what is it, and how do we move faster?
Sure.
I don't really care what it is.
Oh, I have some definite thoughts in that. You're talking my language now.
I just hate to lose these kids because we're not following some sort of process that's by numbers and not by the child.
And one of the things is when we look at all these processes, and then I keep saying is, well, we can't do this. Well, what we can do is provide more support. And it can look like a lot of things, and you need to free up the schedule and give us the resources so that we can help the kids that need help in the way they need to be helped. And that's frustrating. Yeah. So we could call it Tier 3 and give them 2 hours of instruction a day and help the situation instead of maybe rushing off to some compartmentalized, here you go, congratulations. You have just won a SPED certification, you're eligible, and you get 45 minutes, 4 or 5 days a week. You know, instead of a cookie cutter. But I'm with you on that, exactly. All right, let's move on to the next thing. So comprehension difficulties is some of these these things typically hang up your children. If they're not able to come back with story details, this is language 1, right? First language people. If they cannot come up with the story details and you've just been talking about the story, don't even introduce EL into this right now. From the beginning, we're in kindergarten. Okay, we're talking about a little story and they can't give you story details and they're not making a picture in their head of what this looks like. We need to work on that. We may be looking at some comprehension difficulties. Vocabulary, you see this very quickly when they can't make inferences about what, because they don't have all the words they need when they come into kindergarten. Doesn't matter who they are, they need more words. If they can't listen to the story and start making those inferences, we've got a problem. Idiomatic expressions, this hangs up everybody. Okay, first language, second language, any language. Idiomatic expressions will get you. It's raining cats and dogs. My kids are making pictures of kitties and puppies, free pets, you know, falling from the sky. General language impairment. This is something that's fascinating to me. My focus is on reading, and then I come up with language impairment. And what I find is that there have been all kinds of really cruel studies for hundreds of years where people thought, well, we're going to figure out how people learn language. So we're going to take children and we're going to lock them away where they never hear any language. And we had a child that was locked in a closet until she was like 7, 8, something like that. This was years back. And she's been in language therapy all this time, and her language she's got very little language still because of that early language development. Those synapses are pruned, and it's very difficult to learn any language at that point. So we've got children, the dark ages, where they've locked these poor people away to find out if they're going to learn language. They don't. Okay, they don't. When they get it later. Too late. General language impairment. These kids are very interesting. And I didn't think to ask this, but they don't answer WH questions. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. And you'll ask a question and you'll get yeah, that was my look right there. What? I'm talking about the big blue dog, and I ask who or what. I ask a question about this, and I get some off the wall. I'm asking a who question, and I'm getting a what answer. Something that doesn't match up. So pay close attention, because in your first, language 1, if they can't answer those questions, there's a real problem. You've got an ELL student, but when their mom is asking them a question, if they can translate back accurately, and you're figuring out, hey, they're not answering the question as it was asked, and it's not complex. Who is your brother? Well, I have a brother that goes to high school. Yeah, you only have one brother. What's his name? They can't answer that question, there's a problem, and it might be a language impairment. And that's not my area. So, I know a little bit about it. Yeah, I don't know. That's a mystery to me. I've read a lot about it, but I know kind of how it happens. I don't know how to remediate that. That's a speech pathology, pass them on. Yeah, I wish. I'm sorry. I do work with students that are in language classes, and so I know some of the things. We work on sequencing, and we work on answering those questions and picking out details in a story, and keep asking those questions and guiding the answers, but that's all I know to do. Text complexity. Here are the problems. So as you know, as you get older, you're getting more complex text, and that measuring text complexity is, this is an all-out brawl with reading researchers, folks. So when you're looking at AR levels and all of that stuff, that is, every single formulation is different. It's usually based on word length, sentence length, vocabulary difficulty, okay? Or the number of words in word length, how long is the word, multi-syllables, and then how many words are in the sentence. So it's a situation where Grapes of Wrath is a third grade book as far as text complexity, but you don't want your third grader reading that, right? Okay? The sentences aren't really long, the vocabulary is not very complex. Your kids are going to struggle with background knowledge, vocabulary, text complexity, all those things. Have I lost you there? No, move on. Okay. So here it is. Why can't my student read? Here are some scenarios, folks. You've got word level reading right here, okay? And you've got comprehension right up there. If they can read the words on the page and understand them, boom, we got a good reader. If they can understand the words on the page, in other words, they read them and you don't know what they're reading, but they're getting meaning out of that, and it's cool to watch, but it's a little frustrating to remediate, you got a dyslexic reader. So their comprehension is good, their listening comprehension is excellent, but they struggle with that symbol imagery, that getting the words off the page. If you have somebody that can read the words, and a lot of our ELLs will do this to us, okay? Boy, they can whip through that, they can read the words on the page, and they don't have a clue what they're reading. We got a poor comprehender. And then if we've got some guy that can't read the words on the page and doesn't understand what he's read when he reads them, we have a garden variety poor reader. And that's really tough. And when you're in a situation like that, go back to word reading. They've got to read the words on the page first. Word reading first, comprehension second. Don't abandon comprehension, but
bless their hearts. And we will usually say that a person has a dyslexic profile. Of course, with us not being school psychologists or whatever, we can't diagnose it and say, I think your student's dyslexic or whatever. But you say, well, we see some of the characteristics that we tend to see in dyslexia, and just suggest that it might be a dyslexic profile versus your child is dyslexic.
I've got another slide later on that's things to say and things to not say. Things to not say. I've had another student that was dyslexic, and I'm pretty sure that your child's dyslexic. Don't go there. You don't want to do that.
Yeah, and we may be pressed for time on that.
Okay.
And this is the big thing with the dyslexia. I mean, it really is there. It really does exist. It has a neural signature. We can see that on a functional MRI. And so these are things that you tend to see if a person has difficulties, just like what Joanne had mentioned earlier about, being able to rhyme. When you see a word that looks similar to another word, having a difficult time distinguishing that, perhaps getting the letters wrong because they don't have a real sequence to them. So it's not this, a lot of people will say, oh, if we reverse the letters, we're dyslexic. No, they could just be learning at that point. However, if you see on a written page where a student's written something completely different down here from up here for the same word, these are things that we typically see across languages, and also trying to pronounce some of the multisyllabic words, presenting difficulties for them. Let's see.
So is it dyslexia? We're trying to determine.
Yeah, is it or is it not?
Right. So if their vocabulary in their second language is not good, whether they went to school or not, okay, and this is a big problem. A lot of our kids show up, that, and they have never been in school before. But if they have, for sure, they've been in school, they've been getting some pretty good education, and their vocabulary is poor in their second language as well, and you can verify that, we're going to have a greater chance of having a problem. But it doesn't mean that they're dyslexic still, okay? Just because they're having trouble in their first language. Phonemic awareness, we've talked about that.
Yeah, and then that cross-language transfer, the thing that comes to mind is like if a student's native language is Arabic, they don't have the p sound, but they have the b sound, and so instead of saying park, they may read it as bark. So you're getting some of that cross-language transfer that's coming into that second language, English, that we're trying to work. So that these things are definitely not indicative of dyslexia if you see that. And then the thing is, this may take years for this to play out because, again, is it language or is it a learning disability? And so these are normal things that you may see as an ELL person, but not necessarily indicative of dyslexia.
And also after the age of 13, it becomes increasingly difficult for you to hear the sounds, the different sounds in the words. Your ears have finally become tuned enough to one language so that even if you can hear the sounds and the differences in the sounds, you may not be able to reproduce that sound. So that's why you get a lot of folks learning a second language and then they have a terrible accent. They sound like they're from Tennessee and they're trying to speak French. That's why, because you were older when you were learning it, you didn't hear it, and you're not used to trying to. Your ears just don't hear it when you're replicating the sound. It doesn't mean your mouth couldn't make the sound. It means your ears just aren't up to task. All right, so here are some of the factors that you've probably encountered that may make it very difficult to determine if we are looking at ELL or LD, learning disabled students. Do they have trouble following directions? It could be a language problem. It could be a language impairment. Productive language difficulties. So receptive is a lot easier, remember, to hear and to follow instructions, but wow, writing, speaking, infinitely more difficult. And then significant learning differences. So this is one of the things we were talking about is they're having the same problem in both languages. If you're in a fully bilingual classroom, are they having difficulties? So when I taught first grade as a co-teacher, we taught bilingually. And it was pretty quick. We were able to find out pretty quickly if they're able to follow the instructions in both languages, great, and pick up on the sounds and know what's going on, great. And if they're not, then there's an indication that we're going to have a problem. Little progress despite similar peers in those small group intensive remediation. So you've got 4 kids in there, 3 of them are zooming along. They've all got similar backgrounds and they're matched according to the skills that need to be addressed, their deficit areas. 3 of those guys are zipping along, and we've got one that is making no progress whatsoever. If it's not behavior or anxiety, one of these other things could be a problem. Now, I did talk to, because a lot of you have said that you have been in those meetings where we're trying to determine does this person have a learning disability or not, and that is a hot topic. If you have not been scalded alive in one of those meetings, yeah, I'm feeling you, okay? So in one of those particular meetings where we were trying to figure out how to get the student what he needs, I just started researching, and I was looking, and I read a Dear Colleague letter, and somebody was stupid enough to put their name on the bottom of that with their phone number. I'm like, wonder if that works. So I called him up, and I said, hey, I read your letter. And he said, where'd you get this name? And I'm like, you can put it on the letter. And I described the situation, and I said, okay, this is the Office of Civil Rights, by the way. What checklist is there? And so we went down through there. They didn't have a checklist at the time. And he said, okay, I said, here's what we're considering in our team. Dump. And he said, hey, if you're going down through your checklist and you've got all of these things you've considered and your team has determined whichever way, that as long as you're considering all those things, the decision you make will be a good one. Or at least you won't get sued over, was what he said. All right, go ahead and let's flip to the next one. Special ed. So this was one of my children from 3 years ago, or I had her for 3 years, reading at the word level.
Ivan is Ivan in the bed. Awesome. Ivan's head in the bag.
She's also doubly eligible in SPED. And then this is her.
Next year, the new bulbs will send up shoots to these daffodil plants. They will look just like the first daffodil bulb can turn into many bulbs. Next year, the new bulbs will send up shoots to these daffodil plants. They will look just like the.
She's calling the words. She's reading very well. Even her expression is fairly good. And she's very excited about reading, by the way. Very proud of this. Something interesting, I had gotten her, she was a non-reader. Her parents didn't think she was going to be able to read. Her 2 younger brothers, or 2 older brothers, were non-readers. They were certain she was never going to be able to read. And I said, I think I can teach her to read. We can read the words on the page at least. Always ask the parents and get a media release. Hey, is it okay? I want to be sure it's okay. Can I, make with the phone a little video of your child reading, and then they can see themselves, because boy, that is a big motivator. And so I said, okay, I'm going to, and a lot of times I'll say, hey, will you send it to me? If the file's not too big, I'll send it to them. Well, the file was too big. I saw the parents, and I said, hey, I want to show you something. And I whipped out the phone. I said, look. And she was reading, and both parents started crying. Okay? She was so excited. She had come home, and she was trying to read everything, every road sign. And so she looked at her older brother, and she said, Cody, you can learn to read. This is ridiculous. And she sat down. Now this child's had a lot of instruction. And she sat down, and she said, look, this is what you need to do. And she taught him the sounds, just like I had taught her, and took the sight words home from her sight word book and made him learn them. And so he comes back to school, and she hasn't told anybody that she's teaching her brother to read, and all of a sudden he's spontaneously reading in 5th grade. And they're like, what's going on with this? So I start asking some questions, which tells you folks that with the right intervention, with enough perseverance, you can get them to read the words on the page. They can do that. Understanding them is difficult, but reading the words on the page, we can accomplish this. All right, so We don't want to place them in there if they don't need to be in there. It's difficult to figure out what the problem is. ELLs with a learning disability are entitled to a full range of seamless services designed to meet their individual language and learning needs. And you can have that full access to this and click on those and go and get some more information if you would like. So here are some considerations, and this is the hard truth. Scheduling. Okay, scheduling runs the world, and we don't get the scheduling that we want for our special needs children, special being anybody that needs extra intervention, okay? TCAP. Everything rules what we earn on the TCAP score for our school, right? Whether they say it does or doesn't. I've heard it all. But when you have a child that's ELL and special education, they fall into two subgroups. So this child first is going to count in the general population for your overall school score, your reading score. Then they're going to count as an ELL subgroup, and we have to show a certain rate of improvement. Then, if they're also identified as special ed, that puts them in another category, another subgroup, and we have to show improvement in that area as well, right? Because we get dinged. So that puts them as counting for your school 3 different ways, 3 times. That's a serious consideration. Schools think about this. They think hard about this, and they look and they're thinking, is that going to help us or hurt us? Twice exceptional children are unlikely to test out of SPED or ELL unless you have a very robust RTI program and everybody's with it and they are willing to show that information and get them out of there. So you can end up making a decision for a child in 2nd grade that they're still dealing with in high school that may not be the best decision for them.
When they get to middle school, scheduling becomes impossible. There is no way to receive dual services due to the IEP and scheduling. There's not enough time in the day.
Yeah,
so you have to decide if you're figuring out if you're doing it in elementary, what's going to be their best need.
Right. You've got to look down the road. What in the world are we going to do for this child, and what does that look like? And a lot of times, if you haven't been at the high school level, or the middle school level, and you're only working at elementary, it's very difficult to see what that environment looks like, the reality of that other situation looks like. But that child's going to carry that down the road, and we have to meet those needs.
Even in the elementary situation, though, it gives you an elementary environment. It's next to impossible to schedule both SPED and ESL.
Right, and is it just reading, or is it also speech language? You know, you're getting into more and more services. It's really hard, and they're not. Anytime they're not in their Tier 1 instruction, if they're not in their gen ed class, they're missing that core content also, which is a concern. And don't think that the gen ed teachers are above worrying about their scores when those come back and the kids are not. You know, hey, they're getting scored on what they made in social studies, but guess what? They weren't in social studies or science the whole year because they were receiving these other services. So that's reality. So we've got to make these plans, but here's the other problem. Parents don't know how to navigate the system. We pull them in and we're starting to talk about all of these different things, and they're not sure what this looks like, and if they want it, don't want it, they don't know. Here's one thing though, your gen ed teachers will appreciate you greatly if you find a way to support them in the classroom. That pays big dividends. It's very, very hard coming from gen ed. It's very, very hard to be faced with ELL and you don't know what to do, faced with IEPs and you don't know how to make those accommodations that we've agreed we're going to do in there, and you're like, I don't know what this really looks like. I would totally do it. What is it? Okay. Break that down, offer suggestions. Most of your gen ed teachers are going to be like very grateful, especially if they can just spit it out and tell you what's really happening in the classroom without being worried that you're going to judge them on the language they use. I have heard that comment too. Hey man, we don't know the exact language and we don't want to offend anybody, but man, they're blowing up my class because they can't do blah, blah, blah. Hey, I just need to know what's going on. We'll figure it out.
We're hoping that we could go through the SPED referral process, but of course we don't have enough time to do that. But you did say that you do have this PowerPoint on your website. Okay, so it will take you through what the exact process is and give you some additional information. Joanne's contact information is here. It's writingreading.com.